have shield laws or other protections. A pair of cousins from Texas and Louisiana, each sentenced to more than 2 years in prison today for their role in the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol in 2021. President-elect Trump has said he plans to pardon some January 6th defendants. KLTV's Washington News Bureau correspondent Brendan Cullerton covered this case for us.
Federal Judge Paul Friedman gave an impassioned speech in the courtroom today, saying he does not care if Donald Trump pardons January 6 defendants. The former president cannot rewrite history. Friedman said he felt an important need to send a message about the rule of law, noting 140 law enforcement officers were assaulted that day. Friedman says 5 of those officers were assaulted by cousins Cody Connell of Vivian, Louisiana, and Daniel Adams of Goodrich, Texas. The two were among the first to enter the Capitol building during the riot and took videos of their efforts to join the mob and break the police line. Friedman gave both cousins the exact same sentence, 26 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He also issued a fine of $2,000 to both. Federal prosecutors had asked Friedman to issue a sentence of 51 months. The felony counts included assaulting or impeding an officer, civil disorder, entering and remaining in a restricted building, and disorderly conduct in a restricted building. The case initially included an obstructing an official proceeding charge, but the Supreme Court ruled that charge is generally not applicable to January 6th. Judge Friedman says it generally takes about a month for a defendant to receive their summons to report to federal prison, meaning the two could be incarcerated before Donald Trump takes office January 20th. Reporting in Washington, I'm Brendan Cullerton.
2 East Texans are serving prison sentences for their parts in the January 6th riot. Alex Harkrider of Carthage was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Ryan Nichols of Longview was sentenced to 5 years.